great crowd here tonight. Welcome, welcome. My name is Jennifer Hoyer. I'm an assistant professor of German Studies at the University of Arkansas, and I can hardly tell you, actually, how excited I am to stand here before you this evening for a few minutes, just a few. Not only because I have the honor of introducing our esteemed guest this evening, but also because I get to tell you about a wealth of things coming up. We have so many events coming up, I can't believe it. In addition to the otherwise announced Beyond the Holocaust events coming up, and if you'd like a schedule, we have them in the back of the room. Those that are coming up in April, Daniel Levine's talk on the Septuagint, Why Jews Wrote the First Greek Bible on April the 11th, and our next Yiddish film extravaganza, which will be right here in this room, on April the 14th. Also cards for that at the back of the room. Please take lots and share with your friends. There are a number of other events coming that are of interest. This Thursday evening, for example, at 7 o'clock in Giffords Auditorium, the music department is hosting Brian Locke, who will be talking about Prague and the Yiddish theater, and there will be a reception to follow there. Monday, March the 25th, there is a talk and a book signing by Irving Resnick on circumcision and sexuality in medieval Christian and Jewish dialogue, hosted by the Medieval and Renaissance Studies Area Studies Group. Coming in April, I also will be giving a talk now, toward the end of April, just to sum up all the events that we've done, and so that you can all get a sense of what I do in my research, because it suddenly occurred to me none of you actually know why I'm interested in Jewish studies, so I thought we should maybe fix that. And in addition to that, the final University Symphony concert on April the 30th this year will feature Mendelssohn and Mahler. And about 45 minutes before the concert, Dr. Martin Nedbaum, who is also in the audience today, and I will be giving some background information on Jewish life in Germany, the importance of the Mendelssohn family, and Jewish-German dialogue and music history. I can't believe how much there is coming up. So a lot of this wasn't planned even a month and a half ago, and here it is. So, if you would like to keep up, as I need to keep up, you can do that at our website, which we can show you here in a little bit. The web address is on the schedule cards at the back if you'd like to take those with you. Also on our website, you can see video from Professor Judakin's talk from last September. Coming very, very soon, you'll be able to see video highlights from an evening of Jewish art and music from February, and also video of today's talk. So if you had friends who couldn't make it today, or if you needed to go back and look at something again, you'll be able to do that in the next week or so. So, the Beyond the Holocaust series is aiming to shed light on a diverse array of topics in Jewish studies and highlight just how many amazing resources we have in this community and attached to this community. It's made possible by the Legacy Heritage Jewish Studies project, directed by the Association for Jewish Studies. Are you all ready to say this with me now? I feel like you've probably heard it now. Support for the Legacy Heritage Jewish Studies project is generously provided by the Legacy Heritage Fund Limited. The grant does ask that we collect evaluations. You've all got them somewhere nearby. Please do fill one out. The library has also asked if you could fill out an evaluation for them as well. So there are 2 to be found. I'd like to add to students, please make sure you also fill one out. We really, really would like everybody's feedback. And you can simply leave them on the table before you leave this evening. Okay? Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. After her talk, we'll have Q&A, and then please stay around for informal discussion and noshing at the back. Perhaps you've noticed there is quite a spread. Laura Lieber is an associate professor of religion and assistant director of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University. She hails from right here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and is a UA alum. She went on to get her Ph.D. in the History of Judaism at the University of Chicago and her rabbinical ordination from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Her book, which is on display in the Beyond the Holocaust exhibit in the Walton Reading Room at the University Library, Yanai on Genesis, examines early medieval Palestinian poet Yanai's poetic commentaries on the book of Genesis, and has gotten some very glowing reviews, I don't mind telling you. Her forthcoming book, A Vocabulary of Desire, takes a closer look at interpretations of the Song of Songs. This summer, she'll also be participating in a Duke summer program in Germany, so she's even got connections to German studies. Awesome. Today, she will be speaking to us about the matriarchs in a talk entitled Inventing Mothers, Mothers of Invention, Biblical Women Reimagined. Please help me welcome home Laura Lieber.
I can't tell you what a big honor this is for me. I just want to thank Jennifer for the invitation. I think I explained to her very early on in the process that you don't need to invite me here. You just need to give me a couple of dates to choose from and we'll make it work. And it's also so humbling to see so many of my teachers in the audience today. I think if you pay careful attention, you will see your fingerprints on much of what I'm still doing, whether it has to do with my interest in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, the human condition. I know that there's even, I think, most of my thesis committee is here. and in some ways, I'm aware of how far I've come, but I know I wouldn't be here without all of the support, encouragement, hard questions, and gentle nudging that I received in my time at the University of Arkansas. So this is extremely gratifying for me, and I will just try to make you proud. And now I will try to work PowerPoint. Usually I do a text handout, but I figured this would be kind of a lot of paper. So, let's see. This is a little bit of humor. Women in the synagogue. Here they're painted on a wall. It's the Dura Europa synagogue from roughly 200 of the Common Era in modern Syria. And this is actually the infancy of Moses. You can see Moses, that's Pharaoh's daughter. I also thought that sort of interesting that there's a naked woman in the synagogue. But she's bathing in the Nile, and you can see that they're passing the baby off to Yocheved. Anyway, you can see there's a little bark at the bottom. And, but anyway, just because one of the questions that we actually can't answer is whether there were women in the ancient synagogues at all. But we do know that women were present, at least in literary ways, because of the presence of women in the Torah, in the biblical story. And probably, again, we'll come back to this theme, but that there's probably a lot of variation, that there was no sort of uniform custom among the ancient synagogues, and there were probably some communities, well, there were some communities where in the diaspora where we know there were women because women dedicated money, women had reserved seats. Sometimes they were, and sometimes they were not actually Jewish women. We had a lot of Gentile participation in the diaspora especially. But we're going to be talking about the land of Israel, where we have less of a sense of exactly who was in the room. Speaking of, the ancient synagogue. Just a little bit of orientation for us, because I'm covering a lot of ground here, and the materials that I work in are really fairly specialized and esoteric, even within the world of Jewish studies, even within the world of rabbinic Jewish studies. So I want to sort of make sure that everyone's got their bearings, although there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. So just because the synagogue is something that a lot of people, I think, we take for granted, it just sort of seems like it's been here, and sometimes there's sort of an idea that the temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, and the next day they built the synagogue and just kept going. But the truth is actually, of course, a little more complicated, in that the synagogues flourished in Palestine and the diaspora well into the early Byzantine period, so it's also not that they were completely, that they were sort of a cease and desist order, despite the fact that we have medieval, early Byzantine legal codes, like the codes of Theodosius and Justinian, which appeared to place limits on the construction and renovation of synagogues, but the actual archaeological evidence from the 1960s forward especially has made it clear that the 4th through 6th century was a period of great building of synagogues in the Galilee particularly. The earliest synagogues were actually built prior to the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. We have the remains of 5 in Judea, 1 in Delos in Greece, and 1 in Ostia in Rome, outside of Rome. And the earliest evidence for a synagogue actually dates to the 3rd century in Alexandria, and it probably actually functioned more as a locus for Torah study, and maybe sort of akin to what we might now call a JCC, a Jewish Community Center. But it was something that existed while the temple was still standing in Jerusalem, and then it was sort of repurposed in various ways after the temple was destroyed. And certainly after the year 70, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, basically every city and town in the Roman Empire likely had a synagogue of some kind. So one of the things we'll come to is the fact that whatever I'm describing, most of the evidence we're going to have comes from major urban areas, but we have to remember that there were also rural Jewish communities in the Roman Empire also. Let's see. Within these synagogues, there were a number of different potential literary activities that were going on in addition to the prayers and the Torah reading that we might assume were sort of the center part of the synagogue ritual. A lot of these actually relate in some way to the Torah reading, which was the centerpiece. And these are, we have the Targum, which is the Aramaic translation or paraphrases really of scripture. They were originally delivered as a live performance. You would have someone reading from the Torah scroll, just as happens in synagogues now. Then you would have a live translation performed in Aramaic, usually 3 verses at a time. We can tell from Torah manuscripts and Targum manuscripts that it was usually 3 verses and then 3 verses. But they were oral, so what we have now are obviously we don't have tapes of their performances, so now we have written scholarly versions of the Aramaic translations. And it's really hard to call them a translation because they're not what modern Westerners would regard as translations, which is sort of the idea of like sort of a word-for-word rendition. Instead, they were very embellished because they were trying to convey sort of the truth, as it were, of Scripture, which sometimes involved adding a great deal of information, such as when Cain and Abel in Genesis 4 have their argument. There's a word missing in the Hebrew manuscript, but it's clear that they argued. And so the Targums give they give the argument. They recreate for you the argument. Or they may insert, all sorts of things, like in Genesis 22, which I'll mention in a little bit, it says, it came to pass after these things that God called to Abraham, the binding of Isaac. And so the Targum wants to know, well, after what things? So they have any number of potential, and you'll have different versions of the traditions. But the Targums, they're really not what we would call translations. They're really much more elaborate than that and interesting. Then we have midrash, which is from the word to seek out. And I know that I knew there were going to be students here, so it's part of why I put this all up here so you can take notes. But midrash are really the homilies, the sermons. It comes from the word darash, which means to seek out. So it's sort of a seeking out of meaning from the text. And they often include a lot of folklore and legend and stories about different rabbis, which are often very tangentially connected to the events being depicted. And again, so they often start with a biblical verse, but like anyone who's been in a seminar, and it really is like going to graduate school reading this literature, you've been in a seminar and you sort of are talking, and suddenly you're not sure exactly how you got there, but there you are, and then the teacher sort of brings you back to topic. That's what it's like reading midrash. And finally, we come to piyut, which is the genre that I work in. These are liturgical poems, which integrate the reading from the Torah portion. So let's say the Torah portion for a given week begins with Genesis 12:1. So that would be sort of the destination of the first unit of the poem. And it weaves that into the statutory prayers of the synagogue. So the first prayer of the Amidah is the one that blesses God as the protector of the ancestors, the shield of Abraham. So you have to get from God's call to Abraham in Genesis 12:1 and you have to get from that to the fixed liturgical blessing. So part of the structure is fixed every week. The actual text of the prayer, the scaffolding of the liturgy is the same every week, but the Torah portion changes every week. So you have this element of fixity and this element of fluidity, and it was really a dynamic performance. It's sort of akin to sort of the way Bach would write a cantata. You have also, they're very long poems. They're about 200 to 250 lines long, and they're composed of roughly 9 sub-poems. So they're very elaborate constructions. And there we go. So more on this, because this is where we get to my stuff. Piyut. It's a Greek loanword into Hebrew. So it's from the Greek poesis, to do or make, just like the English words poet and poetry. And the term first appears in the early centuries of the Common Era. And just so you know, just sort of clarify some of my vocabulary, that the plural is piyutim, and someone who composes these works is a paitan. So a paitan is a poet. And usually this term is used to refer to Hebrew poems from the synagogue, but they actually exist in any number of vernaculars, including Aramaic, Judeo-Spanish, Yiddish, and other languages. So it can be used sort of broadly or more narrowly. But everything we're going to look at for the most part today is translated from Hebrew. Now, here we have to I have to back up a little bit and tell you where do these texts come from. Because most of the works that we're going to look at today are from around the 5th, 6th centuries of the Common Era. But they were absent from the written record, basically. We didn't know that we had them or that they existed until the recovery of the Cairo Geniza. Now, a Geniza is a storehouse in a synagogue. It's because you're not allowed to just sort of like dump and put in the refuse bin a sacred text, a text which has God's name in it. So to this day, if a lot of like sort of computer programs and things, text programs that are written in Israel or by religious Jews will actually warn you, before you print out a document especially, that the text you're about to print out may contain God's name and needs to be treated with greater respect than most of the things we print out during the day. So if a text has God's name in it, or sort of more generally, if it's written in Hebrew characters, which can mean Hebrew or Aramaic or Judeo-Arabic or other things, it's customary to dispose of these texts in a proper manner, which means you burying them and treating them with a great deal of dignity. Now, the community in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, in Old Cairo, it's sort of like your grandmother's nightmare attic. I was thinking this place would give my mom hives. Because they never threw anything away. Well, they put it in the Geniza, which is the storeroom, which is the way station to properly disposing of things, but they just never got around to that properly disposing of stage. So we have over 300,000 documents in this room, which date the earliest materials were written in around 870 of the Common Era, right up until the 1880s. They were still just chucking stuff out through the door. Which it's fantastic for us, because there were essentially the famous story is two Scottish twins who, if they had been living 100 years later, would both have endowed chairs at major research universities, but because of when they were born and the nature of sort of being a female scholar at the time, they were able to take advantage of their father's wealth and their wealthy widowhood, and they were sort of independent scholars who were phenomenally well schooled in a range of Semitic and biblical languages. They were Presbyterians of the best kind, and they had traveled all over Egypt. They were experts in manuscript work, and they came across, in Egypt, they came across this text that they thought looked really interesting, and they got very excited about what it might be. So they shared it with Solomon Schechter, who at that point was a reader in rabbinics at Cambridge, and he recognized it as the Hebrew text of the Wisdom of Ben Sira, which had previously scholars had hypothesized that there was a Hebrew of Ben Sira, but it only survived in Greek. So Solomon Schechter acquired, with the help of Cambridge University Library, he basically acquired most of the Cairo Geniza. 4 of these 300,000 documents, which were written by Jews living, as I mentioned, from Kiev to Narbonne to India, a huge swath of basically any trade route that passed through Cairo. Roughly 40% of these texts are poetry, and these are the works I deal with. And as the Goitheim described them, they're the living sea scrolls. Because unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are interesting, from the perspective of especially biblical scholarship, because they help us see into the world of first century Judaism, first century both before and after the turn of the epoch, they really represent a very small slice of Jewish life. They're sectarian documents from a very small sect of Jews at a pivotal period of time, but nonetheless, it's sort of a minority opinion. These Cairo Geniza materials give us a window into the life of Jews in the Middle Ages like we've never had before. We have not only copies of rabbinic writings, as we might expect to find, as we had in manuscript versions from major libraries throughout Europe, but we have letters from mothers basically asking their sons, how come you never write? And they actually ask, who's doing your laundry? Which that's not a voice we had from the Middle Ages in any significant way before. We now have Maimonides' own handwriting, and we have the handwriting of Yehuda Halevi and other. It's just unbelievable, the way this sort of revolutionized scholarship in Jewish studies, and in particular in the field of piyut. This I put up, it's a picture of Solomon Schechter sitting at a table with these fragments. So it's a famous picture, but I just like the look on his face. Because that's the thing, is it's not like they were sort of neatly organized, you know, I mean, they were on their way to being recycled, basically. So they really had just been chucked, and they were in fragments, and its scholars were really, in a lot of ways, still are dealing with cataloging them. And a whole section was actually even misplaced and nearly destroyed and then recovered. That's euphemistically referred to as the additional series. So, but there are many adventures, and I highly recommend, by the way, if you're interested in learning more about the history of the Cairo Geniza and its recovery, there's a wonderful book by Peter Cole and Adina Hoffman called Sacred Trash that just came out about a year ago. Okay, so with the recovery of the Cairo Geniza, we suddenly had a quantity of Hebrew poetry that scholars had never before realized existed. And there are a couple of important things to realize. First of all, the fact that they're called piyut, that they're given this Greek name, is significant, because that means, in a way, that the rabbis and the others who sort of preserved these texts knew they were something different, because Hebrew had words for poetry beforehand. It had mizmor, shir, tehillah. The book of Psalms is called Tehillim. They're not biblicizing in their style. They're not even pretending to be something old, which is different, because we have Psalms from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hodayot Psalms, which if you didn't know better when you read them, you would think, wow, these sound like biblical Psalms. So it's easy to write poetry in the style of the Hebrew Bible. These are not those poems. Initially, they were composed for the high holidays and special penitential prayer days, probably going back to the Second Temple period, so when the temple was still standing in Jerusalem. And it's very likely that actually Ben Sira, that text that I mentioned before, was preserved only in Greek, actually in the Apocrypha, sort of the Catholic Bible. In chapter 44, which opens, "Now let us praise famous men," it's a rather well-known line, that actually is sort of the prototype of some of these high holiday poems. Then we have Yossi ben Yossi, who's the first poet whose name we actually have, who wrote in this style. And he wrote, again, for the high holidays and for penitential days. And his style was very much like the Aleinu, for those of you in the audience who know the contemporary Jewish liturgy. The Aleinu is a very old prayer. And it's unrhymed, but it has a very clear beat, as it were. So, Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latit gidula liotzer bereshit. So it has a very strong rhythm, but it's unrhymed. And that's how all these early poems work. And a lot of times scholars who are writing about these poems like to use the analogy of mosaics, because they're not biblicizing in their style, but these poems are dense with allusions to biblical texts. When I was talking to Temple Shalom on Sunday, I used the analogy of if you wrote scripture on glass and then you shattered it and you made new compositions out of those pieces, that's very much the way sort of these poems are written. And like with mosaics, you actually don't lay the glass in a mosaic flat. You lay things sort of off kilter so that they catch the light and they're sort of textured and catch your attention. And often poetry from late antiquity, Christian poetry too, is described as being jeweled in this way. It's sort of adorned with these biblical texts, as we'll see. Okay. We're getting closer, don't we? Yanai, my guy, the palimpsest poet. He's called one of the fathers of Hebrew poetry by Saadia Gaon, who was one of the great Jewish intellectuals of the 10th century. He went from being a name on Saadia's list, a name that we had references to occasionally in early rabbinic literature. We had none of his work. He was just a name. You could have argued that he was just a figment of Saadi's imagination, probably. We had evidence of the other three poets, though, so we had a pretty good sense that he probably existed. With the Cairo Geniza, we recovered his entire complete works. So in multiple various editions. He is significantly the first poet in Hebrew that we know of to use end rhyme, and we'll see towards the end of my talk an example of this. And he actually also was the first to sign his name. He signed it using an acrostic. Those are the 4 letters Yud, Nun, Yud, Yud of Yanai. It's the Palestinian spelling. He does not spell it like a Babylonian. These things matter. And he signed his name, so he's the first sort of non-anonymous poet that we actually have. He wrote for the Palestinian Torah reading cycle, which means that they read the Torah in 3 to 3.5 years. Nowadays, if you go to a synagogue or if you look at a Jewish calendar, you'll see that we read the Torah is read over the course of a single year. And every year in the fall, it's sort of the scroll is wound back to the beginning. That's the Babylonian cycle. I bet you didn't know. So the triennial cycle took longer, and Yanai wrote for that cycle, and it happens at the synagogue, the Bet Ezra synagogue in Fustat was a Palestinian Rite synagogue. So it was a group of Jews who sort of traced their liturgical customs back to the Galilee. They were living in Cairo, but they were practicing the rituals that they knew associated with the land of Israel. So it's sort of like, nowadays you have many generations after that, people identify as Irish Catholics and do things a certain way. So these were Palestinian Rite Jews living in Cairo. He composed poems not just for the high holidays and penitential days, but for every single Torah reading of the year, for all 3 to 3.5 years. Now I mentioned here, was he a murderer? Because one of the medievals, Jews in the Middle Ages, are actually aware of the fact that it seemed very peculiar that this poet who had been so famous vanished. And the story, which crops up in the 12th century, we don't know sort of where it came from before that, was that he was so jealous of the success of his pupil, Elazar HaKalir, and we'll also see some today, that he tried to assassinate Kalir by putting a scorpion in Kalir's shoe. And not a very direct means, but it's sort of he's Scagliari to Kalir's Mozart, as it were. And that his punishment, sort of the greatest punishment that one could inflict upon a poet would be to forget his poetry. So there's a sort of this idea that his poems were willfully forgotten. The truth is that probably because he wrote for the triennial cycle, when that fell out of use, his poems were sort of out of date. It was like he was suddenly Betamax or 8-track or something. He just couldn't really be brought up to date in a way. Whereas Kalir, who wrote mostly for holidays and festival occasions, was more adaptable. Now to some of the matriarchs. To give you an idea of how the poets reworked biblical women, and I chose the women because Jerome, the church father, mentioned that Jews in late antiquity ran to the synagogue on Saturday mornings to hear stories about Abraham, their father. So I figured, well, if they were running there to hear stories about Abraham, their father, then surely they were running there to hear stories about Sarah, their mother, too. So I decided to look at the matriarchs for this talk. We have here a passage from Genesis Rabbah, which is one of those midrashim, one of those sort of homiletical sermons. And I just want you to see just sort of an example of the genre. So here we're given a biblical text. Sarai said to Avram, "My wrong, my injury is upon you." Rabbi Yudan explained this in Rabbi Yehuda's name. Sarah says to Avram, "You wrong me with words, since you have heard me insulted, yet are silent." Rabbi Berechia in Rabbi Abba's name Sarai said, "I have a grievance against you. The matter may be compared to 2 men incarcerated in prison. And it happens as the king passes that one of them cries out, 'Execute justice for me.' The king orders, 'Release him.' Whereupon his fellow prisoner says to him, 'I have a grievance against you, for had you said, execute justice for us, just as he released you, he would have released me. But now that you said, execute justice for me, he released you, but not me. Similarly, you said to God, and I go childless,' in Genesis 15:2. So he gave you a child, but not me." This is Sarai using excellent rabbinic logic in her argument with Abraham. But you'll just notice here that the rabbis are fleshing out the text of her argument and trying to clarify, in what way is Abraham guilty, in terms of Sarah's infertility. Here we have Yanai. And he's writing, this is his poem for Genesis 16:1. This is the second unit of a much longer poem. And this is again in Sarai's voice. And here she says, "My own family, I have failed to build it. So please, from my maid, from Hagar, build me up. So mused, he will notice her," which is a name from Genesis 15, from Genesis 11 rather. Yiska, which is connected to the family of Abraham in a way is regarded as sort of another name for Sarah. But providentially it means he will notice her, in the sense that God will in fact pay attention to her. To the father, Abraham aloud. I too may be built up into a camp. Attentiveness of peace and pleasure, the righteous one shall find no pleasure with me, unless my distress he puts to rest, until the promise of my deed he fulfills. She says basically that basically sort of threatening the pleasure of the marital bed and putting that sort of secondary to the need to procreate. The father listened to she who would bear, perhaps to find hope. Her lament to him, here she quotes Ecclesiastes 3:2. This is not at all strange in the world of the rabbis, for her to know about the writings of King Solomon. There is a time for bearing. There's a time to be born, and as the verse continues, a time to die. But I have been kept from bearing. So she essentially says to Abraham and to God, give me children or give me death. So sort of the implicit completion of the verse. So what we have here is, what I'm interested in, the fact that the poet writes this poem in Sarai's voice. And as with the Midrash, he creates a fairly forthright and strong character for her, which is not like she's a wallflower in the book of Genesis. But here she gets many more lines, many more words, and she has a chance to articulate her position, as it were. So in most of this poem in Genesis 16 is in fact in Sarai's voice, or from her perspective. And here, later on in the same poem, Sarai actually turns from Abraham to God. And you who unbinds the bound, unbind my bindings, and heal my afflictions, Sarai cried out. Alas, was I created unable to bear fruit? If only I could fathom why I am barren. Is it my fault that I cannot bear, or my husband's that he cannot beget? Let him come unto my handmaid, then I will know if he can father. So, in fact, it's actually sort of a scientific method. So trying to determine sort of who has the infertility issues in this. So the fact that, according to rabbinic legend, that Abraham only sleeps with Hagar once. There's one night, and then she immediately conceives. So that's purely to determine, that he's demonstrating his fertility, so that then the issue becomes Sarai's, and then God sends her Isaac eventually. So we have Sarai. I'm just going to give you a survey, and we can talk about some of these individual figures during the Q&A and as we wrap up. But next I want to turn to Leah. We do not have in Yanai's work anything about Rebecca, in case you're wondering why I skipped. We have a passive verb in one poem, which I do suggest could be Rebecca, that she, but the idea of arguing about a passive verb in front of in a public lecture seemed a little bit too remote. So we'll just sort of move on to Leah. Now here, Leah is a figure that the poets feel a great deal of sympathy for, as do the rabbis in the Midrash. Especially this verse in Genesis 29:31. And the Lord saw that Leah was hated. Well, their question is, by whom? That's actually not clear. Well, Leah was hated. Well, who hated her? So they say, well, first of all, maybe she just acted like those who were hated act. She just sort of, poor me. For she was betrothed to an enemy. She was married to Esau. For such was the arrangement, that the elder son should marry the elder daughter, and the younger son the younger daughter. So originally she was supposed to marry Esau, and Rachel was supposed to marry Jacob. But Leah wept and prayed, may it be your will that I do not fall to the lot of the wicked Esau. She realized that she's destined to marry the villain of the whole story. Rav Huna said, great is prayer, that it annulled the decree. Moreover, she even took precedence over her sister. That is, she even got to marry Jacob first. But this was not a bargain struck for free. All hated her. Sea travelers abused her, land travelers abused her, and even the women of the village abused her, saying, this Leah leads a double life. She pretends to be righteous, yet it is not so. For if she were righteous, would she have deceived her sister? So echoing here the biblical story of the fact that she was under a very heavy veil, and that Jacob actually didn't know who he was marrying. And then the next morning, oh my goodness, he married the wrong sister. Which to this day, at a Jewish wedding, before the ceremony takes place, the husband actually, he veils, the husband-to-be veils the bride, making sure he's getting the right sibling. So you can say it's like a lineage of trauma from this. So Leah is church. So essentially she received the husband, she averted the fate that she dreaded, the marrying Esau, but she paid a great price for it personally. In Yanai, this is how his poem about Leah begins, the poem for when this verse that Leah was hated opened the Torah portion. And you'll notice that he begins his poem not by addressing Leah explicitly, but rather setting the stage and talking to the deity. Your might, O awesome one, is in the heavens, but you watch over all who set foot upon the streets. Obvious to you is the love of the lovable, but the hated, the oppressed, you seek out. The hated woman with her weakened eyes was in prayer to you with uplifted eyes. By her merit she preceded her with whom she shared a womb. You graced her first with a child from her womb. You granted satisfaction in place of sorrow. Her shame you transformed to honor. The confinement of her captivity you released, and in place of hatred you opened up love. So, and then we read the verse, and and the Lord saw that Leah was hated. So you'll notice here that we have sort of that the poet is offering his listeners, as it were, sort of insight into the way God works. So you don't need to, Rachel, everybody loved Rachel. She was easy to love. Yeah, she was the obvious candidate for being loved. The Leah, however, was a much harder case, and it was her difficulties made her that much more appealing to the deity. And you'll notice here the reference to her weakened eyes. According to Yanai and the rabbis, the reason that Leah's eyes were weak, that's the etymology given for the name Leah. So she's not like she's sort of like dumpy, fat, and wearing thick glasses. That she cried her eyes out pretty much literally over the idea of having to marry Esau. So she weakened her eyes in prayer. And her name actually probably means like little calf, whereas Rachel means little lamb. Now who wants to calf? Lamb. I don't know. I know how I would feel if my mom had named me ever. So anyway, so we have poor Leah, and so God is the only one here who doesn't hate her, basically. Jacob hates her because she deceived him. Rachel hates her because she deceived her. And the only way God can sort of console her is by granting her children. This is not necessarily a marriage advice that I would give. So here we have the idea that we'll see sort of recurring more and more as the talk progresses, that often the matriarchs, what we have to understand is they're not just characters in a story, but they're really stand-ins for the people. And that here we have a later unit from the same poem. Our eyes, O God, are weak with longing love for you, O beloved, for we are hated by a hateful foe. And it happens that the Romans are identified with Esau. So Esau is still the enemy of Leah's children, as it were. Please see our suffering at home and note how we are hated outside, so within and without, just as Leah was hated. As with Leah, whose suffering you saw, you heeded how she was harassed by hate. At home, her haters were against her. This echoes, this all abused her, the sea travelers, the land travelers, the women of the village. At home, her haters were against her, and outside they hated her even more. Not all the lovable are loved. Not all those deserving of hatred are hated. There are some who are hated below, but beloved on high. Your haters are hated, and those who love you are loved. We are hated because we love you, O Holy One. So really what Yanai has done here is he's transformed the story of Leah being hated into a story of the Jewish historical situation in Byzantine, around roughly the year 550 of the Common Era. And one thing that's very interesting, given that this is sort of beyond the Holocaust as a lecture series, these poems were the poems of Yanai as they were reconstructed by Menachem Zulai in the Schocken Institute for Hebrew Poetry in Berlin. The collected poems of Yanai were the last Hebrew volume published in Berlin in the 1930s. And a few months after Zulai's collection came out, this passage actually appeared in the Schocken Almanac, which it's interesting, you know, I mean, it's one of those deep ironies because it was published in Hebrew with a rhyming German translation, actually, because it got past the censors. But I think you can imagine how Jews in 1930s Berlin would have understood sort of the message encoded here, you know, that we are hated because we are Jews. And so this volume of poetry actually is very important from the perspective of 20th century Jewry also. And this particular poem is always sort of extra resonant with me because you can to this day look up the Schocken Almanac from 1938-39. It's really amazing. It's one of the last Hebrew works, period, published in Germany. The Schocken Institute had already actually moved from Berlin to Jerusalem at this point, but Zulai was still in Berlin. So, okay. So now we move to Rachel, who is, as we've noticed, more lovable. Rachel in the Midrash, just to sort of continue our two genres. So it refers to the house of Israel, who was the house of our ancestor Jacob. Surely Rachel, because in rabbinic Hebrew, house is a slang term for wife. So, which leads to some interesting stories about Potiphar leaving Joseph in charge of his house. So there's also the word bread is also slang for wife, which leads to some very funny medieval illuminations of Passover Haggadot with a man pointing to his wife saying, "Behold the bread of my affliction." But here we have house. So who was the house of Jacob? Surely it was Rachel, for in connection with all the others of his wives and concubines, it's written, the children of Leah, the children of Zilpah, the children of Bilhah. But with regard to Rachel, it is written, the sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife. So here they're noticing the fact that she's specifically singled out as Jacob's wife. And then what did God remember in her favor? Her silence, which she kept on her sister's behalf. When Leah was being given to him, she knew it, yet kept silent. There are actually rabbinic stories about how she helped coach Leah in how to mimic her behavior. And even according to one tradition, she actually lay under the marriage bed and did all of the voicing during the marriage night. So that's really quite a lot to ask of one sibling. And God remembered Rachel, meaning that he sent her children, and this was only fair because she had brought her rival into her home. So we have here the idea that Rachel is finally given, she's given Joseph and then Benjamin. Benjamin, not such a bargain since she dies in childbirth, but he's given children as compensation for all of her suffering. Yanai is not interested in being fair to Rachel per se. Instead, he actually creates a Rachel who is much more like her sister. Sister, thus had Rachel been called, until by her broken heart she was torn asunder. Against her own sister she felt harsh envy. Indeed, envy is as harsh as hell. Here he alludes to the Song of Songs. Love is as fierce as death, and envy is harsh as Sheol. Most praised and beautiful of women, humanity's seed would be given to her. She built up her house with a woman's wisdom. Women and men rejoiced in her. So what interested me in this poem is particularly the fact that Rachel is not actually such a, I don't know, doormat. I mean, she does what she has to do, because that's what, he ultimately can't change the biblical story. But the internal monologue that she undergoes is significantly more complicated. She's not so nice. She really, the fact that he's the only writer I know who really acknowledges Rachel's envy and enmity towards her sister for what happened. Because you could say, Rachel could have made a good case for, it's your poor luck. Your poor luck married Esau. Let me have my happy marriage. But that's not how it worked. And then here we have, from the end of that same poem, here we see it's woven into the Kedusha, the Sanctus, if you know your Latin liturgy. So Sanctus, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. This is where the poem culminates. And you can see here how he weaves in the language of the Kedusha, the Sanctus, into the theme of the poem. So taking the quotation from Ezekiel 3:12, from his place he heard Rachel's prayer and remembered her. From his place he hearkened to her mournful entreaties, and he recollected her. From his place he saw her despair, lest she be forgotten and denied a child, and he kept her in mind. And again, throughout the poem, I just want to suggest that in the same way that Rachel is the house of Israel, that throughout this poem, Yanai actually understands the matriarchs as sort of representing all of their descendants, who are also the house of Jacob, the house of Israel. And that she's sort of setting a precedent, as it were, for what they are hoping to experience. Now, just because all the poems were not so serious, I've given here the part of this poem that I was comfortable presenting in public, but this is an Aramaic poem that I've offered a translation from, because and this is actually in the voice of Mrs. Potiphar, and this shows you the fact that some of these poems can actually be quite entertaining. And this, so I always picture Joan Collins as Mrs. Potiphar, Potiphar's wife. I blame Joseph from the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat for that. But this is in her voice, so she's vamping it up. A certain youth belongs to me, dainty and youthful is he. He looks like a Hebrew, I got him from some Arabs. I want him to plow my garden, but he doesn't want to. He says to me, one doesn't plow an ox together with an ass. So he's quoting, and actually sort of according to rabbinic reading, the ox is Israel, Judah, and the ass is always Egypt. So it's inappropriate. Oh, so often I fixed him a drink. He wants to drink, but won't. Instead, he says to me, that thief, son of a thief, why would you drink stolen water? So he's saying, I won't commit adultery with you. Fit and fabulous is my slave Joseph. His looks have robbed me of my senses. He just glows with grace and kindness. Grace at his right side, kindness at his left. After this comes some fairly straightforward chasing around the bed, I suppose one could say, using some fairly direct Aramaic for translations of "come lie with me," and then she actually frames him. She frames him for rape, and it's very graphic about the use of egg whites and bed sheets. Which that's the part I didn't want to put up here. But this is an Aramaic poem, and one of the theories that I've been working on, I'd like to share, is the fact that because this is not tied to the liturgy in any explicit way, that we see here sort of these poems which are interpreting biblical stories, and actually this was read in congregation on Shavuot, on Pentecost, where they read poems for each of the 10 commandments. So this is actually the poem for "Thou shalt not commit adultery." But this would really be a lively poem to read in the synagogue, I have to say. Is that this is actually, so Professor Levine, I make a very nice sort of argument in favor of this being sort of an echo of sort of Roman comedy and sorts of the entertainment potential of some of these poems as well. So, but she's not a matriarch, although eventually her daughter marries Joseph, so which makes it the whole Mrs. Robinson's weirdness. But the rabbis actually sometimes feel bad for Mrs. Potiphar, and they say that she got a prophecy that was sort of unclear, as all prophecies are, and she wasn't clear whether she or her daughter was going to marry Joseph. And her husband, Potiphar, is a eunuch, so one should feel a little bit So, okay. So we have that's one example. Now, because we looked at Yanai, a little bit of a sort of a little intermission with Mrs. Potiphar. And now here we have a lament by Elazar HaKalir. This is the poet that supposedly Yanai assassinated. So, he was really one of the great poets. And here I just wanted you to see sort of some more ways that sort of Zion herself, Zion becomes personified in these poems and becomes really sort of a matriarch of Israel also. So here we have the personified mother of Israel, the true sort of matriarch. The mother of children moans like a dove. She mourns in her heart and complains aloud. She cries bitterly, calls out desperately, sheds tears, then is silent and stunned. My husband, God, has abandoned me and turned away. He no longer recalls my love as a bride. He has scattered and dispersed me far from my land. He has let all my tormentors rejoice at my downfall. And then God responds, O plant of delight in my garden bed, why do you cry out against me, O my dove? I have already answered your prayer as I did in days of old, when I dwelt crowned in your midst. My dark one, I shall never desert you. I shall reach out again and take you unto myself. Your complaint has come to an end. My perfect one, I shall neither forsake nor forget you. So you notice here, in a way, there's actually sort of an echo of the dialogue that Sarai initiates with Abraham. Only here, for all the prayers sort of recited to the deity, in this prayer, it's one of the places where we get the poet composes a divine response, which is actually rich with language from the Song of Songs and clearly evokes the idea that God is Israel's spouse, and that And sort of echoing even the language of Isaiah 50, you know, where's the bill of your divorce? There isn't one. You know, God, for all the polemic that the Jews are receiving, you know, sort of on the supersessionist Christian ideology that was being articulated at this time, this is a response to all of that. Ultimately, everything Yana writes in some way is sort of an affirmation that Jews have not been abandoned, in the same way that all of the matriarchs at some point articulate a fear of being abandoned. And here we see Zion using sort of similar language, but now it's more explicitly on the allegorical level. Now here, we have from Yanai, sort of another ode to Zion, as it were, which I want to share with you because it's this beautiful piece of artistry. And you'll see here how Zion, in a way, is sort of both the mother and the spouse, sort of the desired destination of much of sort of the yearning in the synagogue poetry. So appealing to God, dwell with us amidst the scattered. Scattered and ransomed shall be the precious ones, Israel. Precious ones honored, though we strayed. We strayed, though in the land we desired. Desired and delightful, a land flowing, flowing with milk and honey. Honey clear and unpolluted. Unpolluted she shall not expel her dwellers who are her keepers. Her keepers keep her covenant. Her covenant was made with her in truth. Truth within her bounds flourishes. So though we are in exile, the exile will come to an end, and it will never be repeated. And I have for you here, this is, I won't tell you what work it took to get the Hebrew into this PowerPoint slide. But I just want you to hear some of the, this is a technique that is strictly in handbooks of style. It's anadiplosis. I tend to think of it as daisy chaining, where the word which ends once one line opens the next. So you'll hear it. I tried to indicate in boldface in the translation too. Lina imanu betoch kfarim, kfarim chaprim, ba'ad yikarim, yikarim nichbadim, ta'inu be'eretz chemda, chemda ta'ava zavat, zavat chalav devash, devash belivo hakara, hakara uval taki dareha, dareha asher heim gedereha, gedereha mosdei vrita, vrita, prutala emet, emet mitocha titzmach. So we have, that's the sound play of the Hebrew, but you can see how he's sort of weaving it together. This is from the part of the poem that tends to, it's anticipating the Kedusha, so he's getting kind of excited. And I put here just, partly because I want an image of, this is the personification of the fall, it's the season of Tishrei. And that's actually Helios, or the Prince of Torah, or the Messiah. No, it's from a synagogue, as much as it does not look like it's from a synagogue. It's from Hamat Tiberias, one of the oldest synagogues that's been excavated, so around the 4th century actually, but it's from the mosaic floor. So this is the center of the zodiac disc. So anyway, so we have sort of those redemptive images from the scenes in which these would have been performed. So sort of to help us wrap up, the work of words. What are these texts doing? Here I've actually borrowed a statement made in reference to Romanos, who was the great poet of Constantinople, Christian Byzantine. He was a contemporary of Yanai, born in Syria, possibly from a Jewish family, but he became the poet of Hagia Sophia. Romanos opened the margins of time, filling pregnant silences with intense interior speech. He also pushed back the margins of space by inserting celestial and subterranean vistas into earthly events. Worshippers were instructed when to look up, look down, look away, stand up, or hold silence. Romanos helped worshippers find the layered meanings and sensory memories. His Kontakia, his Piyutim, remind us that any synthesis of historical and allegorical figures would begin with the body, the sensory body of the biblical figures, and its imitation in the worshippers' perceptions. So the idea that in the church as well as in the synagogue, that people were sort of assumed to identify with these stories of the ancestors are really the stories of the self that you're re-experiencing. And similarly, the effective piyut draws the community in, not only by means of externalized participation through the use of refrains and liturgical phrases, but internally by translating the stories of the Bible into the stories of the present day and making them lively and vivid. Sarai's anger is theirs, Leah's grief and Rachel's longing. Zion is Jacob's destiny and theirs as well. In Midrash, which we've seen some examples of, the listeners remain, as it were, seated in the audience, although the gifted student may earn a turn on the stage. In liturgical poetry, however, the most richly developed character may be that of the people of Israel, both as they appear in the text and more evocatively as the listeners to these works who themselves star in the still unfolding drama of Jewish history. And as I mentioned, in 1938, Menachem Zulai published the poems of Yanai, the last Hebrew book to be produced in Nazi Germany. After the Holocaust, Zulai spoke of the, quote, remnant of a vital faith and naivete into which every true scholar must tap. Without faith, there's no enthusiasm, and without enthusiasm, there's no transcendence. The soul withers and one's vision narrows. Scholarship finds itself mired in trivia, and the great goal is forgotten. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak today, because there's nothing like speaking for an audience of people who do not wake up every day wondering what did the rabbis have to say about X, or what sort of intricate technique do the poets have for this week's poem to remind us why scholarship really matters. Here's from a lady, it's a woman. This is the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, excavated by my colleague Eric Myers. And here we have, just as my final image, the medievalist. This is actually, it's from a medieval manuscript. It's from the Hamburg Machzor around the 14th century. But what's interesting is it's an illumination of a piyut, Itimil Vanon Kala, so come with me from the Lebanon, O bride, which was recited on Passover, so it's coming up soon. And what's fascinating is that this image, you see Zion personified, but she's blindfolded, like synagogue. So that, there's a common sort of trope in medieval iconography of the church triumphant, and then the synagogue defeated, and they're both personified as women, and synagogue is blindfolded because beneath this, the scales falling from the eyes. And what's fascinating is this appears to be, and as much as people sort of try to find ways to argue against it, appears to be actually also a picture of God, as it were, wearing his nice little Jew hat. But it appears to be, it's a depiction of the allegorical marriage of God and Israel. And it's embellishing a piyut, which gives us an insight into for this illuminator, the centrality of these poems for constructing a sort of a resilient Jewish identity by creating a way of having the matriarch stories become the stories of the children down through the ages. Thank you.
If Leah was hated, supposedly, by everyone, and she looked down upon her sister, and she was supposed to be married to Esau, how come most of the tribes of Israel came from her?
Well, that's ultimately sort of the point of the piyut, is that she seemed to be hated, but God essentially said, no, you can't, you're not getting love from anyone else, so the way I can love you is to make you a mother. Which is interesting because she's the polar opposite of most of the other matriarchs who are all, loved and lovable but barren. And Leah is a more complicated character, but the poet in particular seems to be really intrigued by the fact that she is unloved but has great fertility. So there's sort of this idea that it's compensation in some way, that she will have the love of children if not the love of spouse.
But she even put down her sister, Rachel, and Rachel only had 2 tribes.
So to them, I guess that's where you could say that that in the next piyut, or in the rabbinic tradition, that's Rachel, who was destined in some ways to be barren, that she gets children that she wasn't necessarily fated to have as a reward for her own merit. That and I think you sort of say that in some ways that as Rav Huna in the Midrash says, greatest prayer, that prayer averted this decree, this had been fated for Leah to marry Esau. But it's sort of like throwing the brake on the train too late. There were casualties, and so it was not sort of a victimless situation. Instead, it's a way. It was better in some ways than the alternatives. She was not forced to marry this villain, and you had Esau is just considered this barbarous, hated, hairy hunter, uncouth. And then he becomes the father of the Roman Empire. So she averted that decree, but it came at a great cost to many people. But you could say sort of with the flip side is that that the reward was the progeny, which is very typical for the biblical understanding, because the rabbis were very aware of the fact that God kept promising to Abraham that I'll make you as like the multitude of the stars and like the sands of the sea, and it never seemed to work out that way. And the Jews remained a very small people even in Yanai's day. So the importance of the children. Professor Levine.
Were Romanos and Yanai working in absolutely separate traditions?
This is there's the world of ancient hymnography, and we're reaching just now in the last, I would say the last 5 or 6 years, where people working in Romanos, people working in the Syriac Christian hymnography, Ephraim the Syrian, Narsai, these other great Syriac poets of the Syriac Church, Eastern Orthodoxy, and poets and scholars working in the area of Hebrew repute have started talking to each other, which might seem really obvious, but the simple fact is to work in these texts requires mastery of so many different languages that most people are not willing to pretend to have competency across these boundaries. And especially because the Jewish context is so different, what you have is you have a lot of, in the 20th century, a lot of scholarship saying either Romanos, according to a medieval hagiographical legend, was born to Jewish parents, so he therefore took Jewish poetry styles and imported them into the Christian church. Or you have scholars saying, well, Christianity was so dominant, Jews just picked up on the pop culture of their day and just started doing sort of Jewish versions of what was going on in the churches. The crux of the problem is the fact that we don't have forerunners to any of these texts. We don't have sort of early Syriac poetry. Basically, in the 4th century, across the board, this really sophisticated poetry manifests. And they're all different enough that it's not as if the Kontakia that Romanos wrote are clearly related in some way to what's going on in the synagogue and what's going on in the Syriac churches. He was born, whether he was Jewish or not by origin, grew up in a world of Syriac poetry. So it's not clear, sort of like who, you can't really say who got what from whom, but I think that it's clear that we have sort of this sudden sort of cross-cultural Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, Aramaic, sort of suddenly this like tremendous interest in this sort of performative poetry. And one thing, and that's part of why I started looking in general at late ancient theater, is because we have from this period of time, we have really vociferous voices from some of the church fathers like Chrysostom, which are sort of speaking against theater, but at the same time you have sort of the if you can't beat them, join them mentality. And there are things that are intrinsically Jewish about them. You can't say Romanos just borrowed Syriac poetry either, but something happened in like the 3rd century. A lot of things happened in the 3rd century, but something happened in the world of poetry where it seems to be, and it's hard to know. I mean, did people hear things as they walked outside? I think, in some ways, I think there is an element of this is sort of the general culture, sort of a shared hymnographic tradition that's emerging.
On the Cairo Geniza, where are those 300,000 documents today? Are any of them still in Egypt?
No. Most of them are now in Cambridge. Some are at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, but they're being organized, cataloged, digitized. So there's been a lot of work on digitizing, which has made scholars sad because now they don't have to go to Cambridge anymore to look at them. But it's just, but sort of getting public, and that's the thing is it's just an overwhelming amount of material. And the funny thing, like with Yanai, the reason I call him the palimpsest poet is because Yanai was written, a palimpsest is where you would take a scrap of parchment, and because parchment was expensive, you didn't just get rid of it, you scraped off the writing and you wrote over it again. But you usually can read the underwriting remains, and then the overwriting is, Yanai was the overwriting on a text of the Aquilas Greek translation. And so scholars are spending a lot of time trying, in the early part of the 20th century, trying to reconstruct the Aquilas Greek translation. And it was Israel Davidson, who was teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary at that point, who actually stopped to read the overwriting and realized that it actually had Yanai's name as an acrostic, and it was just like, I found this like missing poet. So we have sort of this, it's unbelievable that we went from not having him at all to having sort of his whole collection. But but none of it really is in Cairo anymore. In the synagogue, yeah, I mean, it's a big tourist site. You can now go see where it was. But it's and it's not just like, you know, a little closet, it's a really vast space. So, yeah. Oh, I thought you had.
I did. That was the specific question. How big was it?
It's a big.
I did kind of wonder if it was a little attic.
Yeah, I mean, Solomon Schechter in the late 1890s, they just boxed it up and boxed it up and boxed it up, and then I cannot. I mean, I like a little jigsaw puzzle as much as the next person, but I cannot fathom how people, the mind it takes to sort of look at a fragment and to identify a part of a poem written in another hand from another manuscript and say, I think this is part of the same poem, and start putting it all together.
I have a question myself, actually. I know some of your other work deals with performativity in poetry in the ancient synagogue. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and what that would even look like, especially for students in the audience who might not have any sense of that?
Well, yeah, because I mean, part of it is it's very easy to get caught up just sort of in the content of these poems, especially when you're translating them and trying to figure out, you know, who's speaking to whom, and trying, you know, because especially when you're doing a translation, you have to put in punctuation and quotation marks, which the Hebrew manuscripts don't have. Some of the Hebrew manuscripts don't even break it out into lines. So you're having to sort of, based on end rhyme, figure out where the lines break. And I realized at one point that translation is a kind of performance. I realized that sort of the interpretations that I have to make when I'm translating are very similar to how sort of someone performing these pieces would have actually had to, the decisions they would have had to make. Because most likely, based on analogs to how we know Romanos was performed in particular, Ephraim the Syrian actually had these fantastic choirs of female monastics. I don't think there were female choirs in Yannai synagogue. I don't think the women were that in the synagogue. But I think, you know, possibly we had choirs and things in the big urban areas. But just in general, like, how do you convey these? And I realized, like, well, if you know, because I'm having to decide when I'm translating, do I capitalize the letter H for he? That's a significant thing in an English translation, and if you're doing it in an attempt to be clear. In the same way, the poet or the performer had to sort of shape these characters, that the words on the page are really just the starting point for the creation of the character. And I can think, you know, when Sarai is speaking to Abraham, what's her body language? How does the poet understand the emotion? Is she bitter? Is she desperate? Is she optimistic? You know, I mean, how does sort of, and you could, it's different if you read it different ways, and the words don't demand any specific interpretation. And so I've been looking, you know, so there's this whole question of, like, you know, what role does the poet shape in sort of shaping these characters, the performer? You know, because obviously these texts lived on after the poet, so the performers would have had, and if you think about it, you know, we always sort of talk about the way, you know, so-and-so's King Lear and so-and-so's Macbeth. You know, I mean, the actor really does a great deal of shaping in how a performance is crafted. And part of what's fascinating for me about the matriarchs in particular is these were male actors, as it were, performing these female roles and embodying sort of these female, and sometimes, and actually I'll take advantage of our own stage. Part of my interest in the performativity arose because when I was a first quarter graduate student at the University of Chicago, this somehow came up, and Menachem Brinker, who was one of my teachers, he's like the emeritus now, he was the head of the philosophy department at Hebrew University, winner of the Israel Prize, you know, really, like, you know, but he got so excited, he said the poet would stand here and say, you know, like, I'm Moses, and he would say, yes, God, and then he would run over to the other part of the stage and say, Moses, I told you. And then he would run over, and it was so, to see Menachem Brinker run around like that at the front of the room made me realize that there was something kinetic to these works. And I'll get back here to the microphone because I know it's kind of a little hard to hear me probably at the back of the room. But that there was sort of a physicality to these works even. So I've been really, so Aldrich's Gestures in Roman Theater is one of my favorite books right now. Because those are the vocabulary, I think it was sort of a vocabulary of body language that really, I think, like, you know, these are like the script, but it'd be sort of like, you can't just read, you know, you can't just read Shakespeare to yourself. You know, you have to hear the voices in your head. Even if you never get beyond sort of just hearing them in your head, because there haven't been stagings of a lot of these things in a long time. But there's something very different about trying to really sort of imagine and realizing, even when I talk to colleagues who are a little bit skeptical about some of the specifics of performance, that even when you're just reading midrash or something in your head, which is much more literary genre, that you're also doing a performance in your head. You know, and I sort of tell them, anyone who's heard a beginning student read a language aloud, where they're just struggling with the words and they're not yet to the point of doing intonation and inflection and things, that you're sort of like, you know, you're not ready for Broadway yet. I think, you know, that there's sort of that same element that you don't realize it when you're reading it to yourself, that you're actually picturing things. And that with this liturgical poetry, you know, where the liturgy is theater and sort of theater is performance, that there really were elements of these where I think that they were brought very richly to life. I can run around some more.